Para sí hay bastante gente.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this session on the impact of privatization on the right to education. So we choose a meeting format, so I will ask you please to switch off your microphone, otherwise Eleanor will do it for you to make sure there are no voice when people are speaking. And we will have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. And so you can choose your language at the bottom of the screen. You have the small globe, which where is written interpretation, and you can choose your channel. I myself speak probably mainly in English, but may switch in other languages over this time. So thank you very much for joining us today on this topic on the privatization in higher education comparative perspective, which is part of the UNESCO World Conference on Higher Education. So we are very pleased to be part of this global discussion. We have made the effort to have this event in 3 languages. With the aim to ensure more inclusivity and to ensure like different type of information from different regions can be covered, and we are not only focusing on English speaking or English research. So thank you very much all of you for being there with your own language, and thanks for the interpreter for being with us today. And be patient, all of you, around the translation. And again, you can choose your languages. So we are very glad to have for this discussion 4 academics from 3 continents who will discuss with us their perspective. So from Latin America, from Senegal, so more West Africa, and in Europe regarding France and Switzerland. So maybe I haven't forgotten to present me, but I'm Delphine Dorsey, the director of the Right to Education Initiative, and with my organization, we are developing more collaboration with academic. And again, I'm very glad to have you today around this table. As the research you are doing on the dimension of the right to education are very important to the realization of the right to education is thanks to your research. Like we can assess what the situation is in a country when we can report and share this to states in order to address any issue and develop better law and policy in order to realize the right to education for all. So really glad we can collaborate with all of you. The Right to Education Initiative, for the 4 past years, we have been working on higher education in France, looking at inequalities in this country, collaborating with prestigious school called Sciences Po, and also in the past 2 years with Thibaut Lauwerier, who is with us on the table, looking more specifically at the privatization issue. We've been ourselves working for years now on the question of privatization at all levels of education, looking as well at the commercialization of education and how this may impact the realization of the right to education, exacerbated sometimes inequality, segregation, and even the quality of education. These have a particular dimension when we look at higher education, because the cost of higher education is much higher than at the other level, and also because states have the obligation to prioritize the other level, and of course as a start like primary education, and sometimes they put a bit on the side the financing of higher education. And therefore, we can see a development of privatization of higher education at this level. So there are particular on goals there, and we will see that with the presenter today. This raises some questions, including around the debts that students are carrying, or even the perspective and the role of public education in higher education level, and we'll see that particularly in the Latin American region. So this is in brief. There we will cover different dimensions. We will be able to engage with you. So we will have a presentation of the five panelists, but you will be able to interact with them after that. So feel free to put some question in the chat already if you want to, and we will take question after the presentation to continue discussing this topic. So as a start, I would like to invite Fernanda Saforcada from Argentina. Es una profesora e investigadora en la Universidad de Buenos Aires.
She is a professor and researcher in the University of Buenos Aires and the National University of the West. She coordinates in the area of research of the Institute of Study and Training for the CONADU. In this area, she directs the research project, privatization and marketisation of the universities in Latin America. And some of these of her results have been, she will be comparting her results in this panel. So Fernanda, I am going to give you the floor to give you your perspective from the region of Latin America. And then we will have a focus on Brazil. And then we are going to go to Senegal and then to Europe. So Fernanda, please take the floor. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Delphine. So I would like to thank you all to be here today, the possibility to speak on higher education. It's great to be able to share with you some of these questions that we've been working on within this area. So I'm going to share my presentation. Can you see my presentation? Can you see it? Great. So what I'm going to share are some results that Delphine spoke, a research project that we've been developing since 3 years, which has been driven forward by the University of CONADU, which is the Federation of University Teachers in Argentina, which is an alliance with the Education International. So this project has the huge responsibility of we have been carrying it forward together with Daniela Atairo, Lucia Trotta, in collaboration with other colleagues who have been contributing as well. So with this investigation, we have been proposing to look at the ways that higher education has been privatized and marketized in Latin America. And we're looking at 4 cases within Argentina, Chile, Peru, and the Dominican Republic. So I just have a very short time here today to present this, but I'm just going to talk about some of the questions referring to the region. I'm not going to look at national cases, and I'm not going to develop this. I'm just going to focus on presenting 3 of the critical nodes or points of this study, of this investigation. So the first critical point, what we call hyper-privatization of higher education. So in Latin America, we currently have one of the 2 most privatized regions in the world. So the second most privatized region in the world, according to UNESCO, to their data. As you can see here, in Latin America, it has almost 54% of students of higher education in the private sector. So to just give you an idea of what this means, if we compare this to the global average, it's only 33% of students in the private sector. In Europe, it's 13% of students in the private sector. And in Latin America, we have around 54%. So this configuration started in the 90s with the context of neoliberalism, and it's around three questions. On one hand, there was a huge expansion of demand for higher education, which was accelerated in the last few decades in the 20th century. And in parallel to this, above all in the 80s and 90s, we also lived through regressive policies looking at public financing for universities. And this was within a context of dominance, market dominance, when focused towards public policy, so that knowledge and education were seen as business opportunities and were understood from this a commercial perspective, a marketing perspective. So this meant that the greatest demand of higher education and lessening of public funds for universities meant that these conditions were generated towards privatization. So what was facilitated was an opening for private universities, and public universities had a lack of resources. So there was a selectivity of students, and that meant that there was a displacement from the public sector towards the private sector. So this meant there was a strengthening of the existing private universities and an opening in various countries for a large amount of private universities of low cost, in many cases, very low quality as well. So this wasn't the same in all countries, but if we just look at many of the countries where we have these characteristics of this process. So the privatization trends in university has been a constant, and it's meant that we currently have our current perspective where we have this hyper privatization of higher education. Can we just go back to the last slide? I want to show you that when we look at distribution of students in the different sectors, if we go have a look how they are distributed between institutions, we can see that 67% of university students are in private universities in the region. And if we look at the gradients of students, we can also see that it's growing. And we have a majority, almost 60% of students who graduate from private institutions. So that means that our panorama that's being built is that we have a perspective of more students in the private sector than in the public sector. 6 out of 10 graduates graduated from private institutions, and 2 out of 3 institutions are private within the higher education sector. So the second critical point that I would like to share with you is I would like to start by looking at, when we talk about privatization, we're not just talking about the market, we're also talking about 3 sectoral sectors. These could be economic, but they could also be ideologic and political. So if we look at this phenomenon of privatization from this perspective, if we look at the political dimension of privatization, main point of this is what we call public policies of privatization. So this means that the development of state policies or international government policies is to strengthen the private sector and to commercialize, marketize this sector. So when we look at financial policies, there are some central points. There is a lack of public resources and adequate financing to guarantee public universities. So it means that they can't. There is a very strong push towards privatization. And if we look at a strategy of moving flow towards the private sector. And if we look at public universities, they also trying to capture resources through countries which historically higher education has been free. So they are trying to get pre-university courses, and this is a way of getting more private funding. So when public universities are operating in market conditions, this contributes towards a privatizing trend in the public. So this generated in the 90s. In the 90s, there was a reduction in public financing, and this, therefore, in many universities of Latin America is still happening today. So these practices have been generating a ever greater, there's not so much difference between the public and private universities now in the 21st century, but in more recent times, what we've observed is that there is a greater fluidity between the distinction between the public and the private.
Ahí está. Esto se vincula también con las políticas de privatización.
So this is linked into privatization policies, but I'd like to look at something specific here, not just have to do with this action of state, but the actual private sector itself, how it operates, and acquired great capacity for influence, for lobbying in the area of public policy. So it's worth having a specific look at that. This is sort of like a gradual erasing of distinctions between the public and private sector. On the one hand, there's a symbolic dimension, as if public institutions and private were the same. The idea that certain private forms of institutions are public because they're not non-profit making. So this is, we see the political dimension. In these cases, the private universities, even then when they're not non-profit, they seem to be associated with certain particular interests, especially the people who run those institutions. And then we also see in many countries, the idea emerged that the idea of a lot of public universities at low cost, different from the traditional ones. So they set up a new framework, and the distinction was no longer private or public, but it's like sort of offsetting traditional against new, or commercial universities against non-commercial ones. Or in many countries, they say we shouldn't talk about public-private. We should just talk about the university sector. Are they a quality or not? So in this construction of separating or erasing the distinction between the public and the private, I said that it also has a political, because this sort of erasure or this is seen in a growing participations of representatives of the private university sector in bodies that regulate and in government of the university system and the science and technology systems of those countries. We also see an economic dimension, in increasing transfer of public resources to the private sector. Now, historically, these resources for science and technology were mainly aimed at the public sector, but we've gone from that model to another one in which a growing part of these resources are redirected to the private sector on a supposed equal basis between the institutions. But in the 90s, we talked about the reductions of public-private resources. In the 21st century, there's a big cycle of expansion in public funding for higher education. But it didn't change the practices inaugurated in the 20s But in the face of the growth of these resources, they set up mechanisms to allow that a lot of these public resources should be redirected to the private sector. There's not a lot of information. We have some data on the mechanisms, but there's few quantitative data on this. And one of the things, there seems to be an interest in that it's not sort of split into the private or public things, but we've seen it in terms of inclusion grants, so grants generally, allocations for research, for example. I'd be very interested to have more information about how these grants are distributed. Well, we've got some here in Brazil. We've seen where the transfer has been, the transfer of public resources to the private sector. I'm coming to, so the series of a mercantilization, of commercialization of this, of the public market, has major dimensions. And I think it raises major challenges. The university system it's not just the university system in itself, the incidence on public policy and its construction of the social structure and development perception. If we consider the implications this has for Latin America and other regions too. Most of the professionals, the intellectuals and experts should come from the fact that they are happening. It's happening that most of them are coming from the private sector, defending the interests of their owners or whatever. It's very important to know what is happening. Latin America is the most unequal region in the planet in this respect. So the strengthening of the public is an essential precondition for the creation of more democratic societies that are fairer. And in terms of policies, we need this to be strengthened so public university can be more public, that they're committed to and carry out on their work and their on the basis of the common good. That's what it's all about, basically. That's why it was declared in the higher education conferences in Latin America. It would be very good if we could recover confidence in higher education on a world level. It's a social asset, it's a human right, a universal right, and it's an obligation of the states. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fernanda, for sharing that vision of Latin America. We know
como lo has subrayado, con muchas desigualdades.
It has a lot of difficulties. The financing of education, where does the money go? We're going to carry on talking about that. So thanks very much for putting that perspective to us. The idea of the private sector encroaching on the public as well. And how does education work? Something to be followed up. I'd like to remind everybody, you can ask questions in the chat. I don't know, we'll have time to deal with them all afterwards, but as many as we can.
So we are now going to move to Brazil. So we stayed in Latin America, but we are going to focus in Brazil and look at I think you should, Fernanda, puedes, no, está bien. So we are going to move, as I said, to Brazil with Rosana Heringer and Flavio Carvalhaes, who are going to give us the perspective of Brazil. So Rosana is Associate Professor of Sociology of Education at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She coordinates LEPES, the research group about higher education at the School of Education. She has published many articles and book chapters about race relation and race discrimination in Brazil, affirmative action policies, inequalities in access and retention in higher education. She's currently coordinating a research project about assessment of affirmative action in higher education in Brazil, outcomes and future challenges. And she will present with Flavio Carvalhaes, who is a sociologist with expertise in social inequality, education, and higher education. His scholarship examines inequalities in the Brazilian educational system, the transition from school to work, processes of higher education expansion, among others. Currently, Flavio works with graduate students and Brazilian civil servants from the Ministry of Education to adapt administrative and registered data for the use in scientific research. He's looking at both the supply and demand for higher education to produce innovative insights that can inform policies regarding the regulation of higher education in Brazil, as well as how access to segments of the educational system can become less unequal. He holds a PhD in sociology from the Instituto de Estudos Políticos Sociais de Brasil, and is currently professor of sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you very much, Rosana and Flavio, for being with us today and give us a bit of focus about Brazil. The floor is yours.
In fact, I will start, Delphine. Me first. So I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you, Delphine, for the invitation. I will share the time with Flavio. So my role here is just to give an overview about the current aspects of inequality and access to Brazilian higher education, and Flavio will continue with more specific research results. Flavio can change, please. So just to give you an overview, this is just some advertisements from private universities in Brazil. For those who are not from Brazil, these are people that are very popular in TV, artists and people that are responsible for important shows in TV. And it shows how is this appeal for more massive information for enrollment in these universities. And in fact, yesterday there was a story in a Brazilian newspaper talking about education courses to education career that were presenting 3-year graduation with $20 per month per tuition in Brazil. So this is kind of where we are now. And I think the case of Brazil illustrates very well what Fernanda just presented for the whole scenario of Latin America. Flavio, next, please. So we're going to show this expansion of higher education in Brazil in the last 20 years. This very tiny map here shows the number of municipalities that in 2000, in the first map, and 2010, had some higher education institution, private or public. So just for you to have an idea of how this has expanded, and after 2010, it has continued. Next. What we can say is that higher education is has been historically taught for Brazilian elites. So it has been along the 20th century, a very small number of institutions and number of enrollments. We had 2 waves of expansion in the 60s and in the 80s, 90s, mainly through private institutions. And in the years 2000, we have an expansion that was more linked to expansion of public education, focusing on less advantaged students. Next. The data, that more recent data we have for 2020, 2020 shows we have almost 2,500 higher education institutions in Brazil, almost 90% of them private. They are, in fact, most of them are small institutions, but we see a progressive concentration in bigger groups, economic groups. And in terms of universities, we have 203, almost split half and half between public and private. It's important to say that public, especially federal institutions in Brazil, are considered to be, in fact, better quality, tuition-free, more selective, with total budget covered by the state, and they have 23% of enrollments. While the private institutions, most of them, as we saw above, they are not universities, they are small institutions. They charge tuition that varies a lot according to quality. And in general, they don't have very good quality, and they concentrate 77% of enrollments. And among the policies adopted for expansion of higher education in Brazil, we have, during the first decade of the 21st century, the system for unified selection, that is more for the selection for public higher institutions. But then it's important to mention the two main programs that we have for access to private higher education institutions. One is the ProUni program, that is probably what shows the data that Fernanda has shown about Brazil related to fellowships in the private sector, is mainly concentrated in these two programs. ProUni is fellowships supported by the public sector for students in private sector, and the FIES program is through student loans, also that has expanded a lot during this time. Next. So today, what we have in terms of enrollments in 2020, we have almost 9 million students, being 3 million distance education, and this has been a huge growth in the last years, especially with the pandemic also, but not only. And in terms of admissions, we had also a big increase in terms of distance education. In the year of 2021, almost 1 million enrollments, admissions, but in terms of distance education, almost 100% in private institutions. Next. And this is my last slide, then I will give the floor to Flavio, just to show this goes only to 2017, but you can show the huge increase of enrollments in Brazil since 1980, but you also can see the difference between the size of enrollment and the proportion of private enrollments during this time. Flavio, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Right for Education, for organizing this important event. I hope we'll have a good discussion. So I'll move on to presenting a study that focuses on how the market for higher education became more concentrated in less institutions. So most of the supply of higher education, as Rosana said, was and still is distributed among small colleges, but there is a huge process of fusion and consolidation that is moving towards huge conglomerates that operate in the stock market and etc. And the market is turning to a few private for-profit actors responsible for a lot of enrollments. And I will show you some numbers to illustrate that. But first, I will give you an idea as that complements Rosana's arguments. And just to show you, there is a huge space for developing higher education in Brazil. In comparative perspective, people aged from 19 years old, and this figure here is the only one I found with a comparison, but you can, and it involves secondary and tertiary education, but you can see that only 40% of youngsters are enrolled in an educational institution. So there's a huge space for improvement. And in Brazil, in comparison to Mexico, Argentina, and other Latin American countries, we lag behind, and as well as in comparison to other developing countries. Moving on to the focus of my presentation, I will try to illustrate a process of market concentration and consolidation, which I think it's important to characterize what is happening and what can we expect from the future in Brazil. And Rosana already showed us an important topic after the pandemic, but in the Brazilian case, distance education is very important to discuss. There are a lot of open questions, but distance education is becoming very, very important. I can summarize the results that I will show here as a combination of, let's say, virtualization that was happening before the pandemic already, and it became even more important. And it's a combination of virtualization and private education, especially concentrated in for-profit institutions that drove the supply of higher education expansion in Brazil. And these combinations are very important to understand our context. So I use data about all institutions, all enrollments, and I can give you more information about the data and measurements in the discussion part of our discussion. Here it's just for you to have a temporal dimension of how enrollments were and are distributed across these four combinations across time. And you can see that distance education, I'll focus here on distance education, that was virtually non-existent in 2002, and it's now, it was in 2016, my presentation stops at 2016, already 17% of the total enrollments. If we add the public segment, which is tiny, is 18%. But here I want to characterize how concentrated expansion was. And let's look at this graph here that looks like an elephant, right? And I will tell you how to interpret it. So we can divide a distribution of enrollments in 100 parts in 2 points in time. And that's what we do here. So we organize in ascendant order the institutions by site, and we say that, and divide this distribution in 100 equal parts in 2002 and 2016. Then we say that institutions that are on the bottom are in the x-axis here. It's institutions that are in the first group. We call them small institutions, and institutions that are in number 100 are big institutions. And each group has the same size of institutions, but institutions can be of different sizes. So we can compare across time these tiny segments, how much they grew. We can basically subtract the most recent number, which is 2016, and compare it to 2002 and calculate a rate of expansion across time. And we see here, so let's look horizontally at this graph and move from left to right. We can see that all institutions grew in size. So small institutions grew, which are more on the left, grew around 50%. As we move to the right, growth rates grow as well. But then we reach a level of smaller growth and then an explosion of growth among the biggest institutions. So growth was very unequal across institution sizes. And those institutions that grew more are for-profit institutions. I have separate data that shows that are for-profit institutions and that especially focused on distance education. We can look at the same number, but we still divide these 100 groups, but instead of looking at rates of small groups across 2 points in time, we look at the accumulated growth that happened in the period, and we see that 1% of institutions concentrated 35% of the whole growth of Brazilian higher education. And once again, these institutions are for-profit institutions that have shares at the stock market and that invested a lot in distance education. I could show you specifically these, that I can use indexes that synthesize these numbers. This is what I show in this table, but my time is running out. So I will skip it. We can go back in discussion. So I think that our presentation illustrates very well what Professor Fernanda Saforcada showed with discussed with the Latin American case. And with Brazil is very representative of private education for the whole world, right? And what is happening. And I think that we need that among many topics of concern for future research, we could discuss the quality of this access, and also the burden on students, and how they become dependent on loans and these types of financing that may jeopardize their future and in their lives at other points of their life cycles, right? So thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flavio and Rosana, for presenting about Brazil and show us how these inquiries have been used. And I think this go back to this question Fernanda raised about the financing of higher education, because we see their growth of students, it seems like all have been absorbed by the private sector. So I think this raises again this question on how we finance higher education, which I think is going to be a key question for the World Education Conference this week. And the states, I hope they are going to discuss how best to finance higher education. And you brought as well this question of distance learning and distance education that develop a lot, and mainly with private actor, and as you said, like for-profit actor, which raise another question, no? Because Fernanda was showing as well the different type of private actor, but they are, when we are started to talk about for-profit actor, which have an impact then, as you mentioned at the end, on the burden of the cost on students, raise particular issue when we are going to try to achieve equity, equality, and a better social justice in society. And I think what was interesting, and maybe we can get that, I have 2 points, like maybe we can get for the discussion later, was very interesting to show how public education seems to be of more quality, and how then we can ensure like everyone can access that, and all these questions then is linked to the question of selectivity you mentioned. And we discussed that recently in some discussion with UNESCO about the question of merit and capacity, and how this selection left many disadvantaged groups behind, and how we can address that as well. So this is my other question to raise in relation to the privatization of education. Thank you very much for bringing this perspective from Latin America with the focus on Brazil. And we are now going to move to Sénégal. Nous allons maintenant aller au Sénégal, en Afrique de l'Ouest.
So let's move to Western Africa with Jean-Alain. Jean-Alain Goudiaby is a sociologist of education and training. He is a teacher researcher at the Assane Seck University in Senegal and works mainly on educational policies, university governments, academic mobility, the dynamics of research production and funding, or on an everyday technical objects of masculinity. His activities are part of a global reflection on the dynamics of system construction in a context of strong constraints. He is the scientific director of the Institute of Education, Family, Health and Gender of the Assane Seck University. And in this capacity, he coordinates and participates in several research projects on education. Jean-Alain is a member of the Francophone Research Network on the privatization of education and recently coordinated in Senegal the research project Private Higher Education and Inequalities, led by Etienne Gérard, with funding from the AFD.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Okay. So I'm very happy to be here this afternoon in order to share my research regarding the privatization. I would like to thank my colleagues who talked just before me, and basically I'd like to give you an overview about this issue of privatization of higher education in Senegal. What are the opportunities, what are the constraints, and what does it shows in terms of inequalities? In order to do so, we should set ourselves in a specific context, because today, if we talk about privatization, this is also because it raises the issue of knowledge and how it is to be found in local dynamics, because we are going to notice that privatization basically fits in both local perspectives in terms of public policies, but also in terms of development of higher education. What can be seen also is that this issue of higher education and privatization has not been of much interest for researchers, and it's only recently that we started paying interest to higher education. And there was a shift in the years 2000 because the supply of higher education literally boomed with a privatization that can be found also in public universities, but I'll come back to this later. Last but not least, as an introduction, basically, it's something that Senegal shares with many African countries, but we will see that we have enrollment rates in higher education that are very low, but simultaneously there is a strong growth of the student population. So basically, this also explains why public universities have difficulties to deal with this demand for education. So the demand has boomed, and this phrase, it has been multiplied by 3 since the year 2000, and it has consequences. So this raises a question: how does privatization of the higher education in Senegal structures the right to education? So there are many things that we need to discuss. First, we need to talk about the characteristics of higher education in Senegal, and we need to focus on the private sector. We will also address the diversity and disparities in the privatization process, and also how inequalities are managed. What needs to be known is that in talking about Senegal, the first experiences in terms of higher education dates back to the colonization. The very first universities in Senegal was created as a French university.
So basically, we will have to wait until after the independence to see universities flourishing. So it was the only French-speaking university at that time. After independence, the Dakar University becomes the Senegal University. Today, Senegal counts 8 public universities, 5 higher vocational education institutions. So it's not the same figures, as you can see, the same sizes compared to Latin America. And mostly what's new and important is that we have 300 private institutions and universities. So these include private institutions or institutes. So the university map was reinforced in terms of supply, but with specificities and notably in terms of development. So today, how did it, why and how did it develop so fast? First of all, it's the questioning of the Occidental model. As I was saying, the Senegal University was first a European university. And from that point of view, it was not necessarily adapted to the local context. So there is a kind of questioning of public universities, first on the donors' side, because they thought that these institutions was consuming a lot of resources with low returns on investments. And also, there was an insertion rate that was quite low based on the type of universities. And the third factor is the opening to the market with strong recommendations at that time in 1992 from the World Bank. And finally, there was the devaluation of the CFA francs. So the state had less and less opportunities to meet the demand. And therefore, we could see various universities appearing. And the very first institute or business school that appears in Senegal is the EESN, the Superior Management Institute in 1992. But to characterize these private institutions, the funding is often borne by the student. If we compare to public universities, the training are more general, the funding is from the state, but more and more private offers and the teachers are more and more certified. Another important element here that is kind of blurring the border between the private and the public, it's this decision from the higher education minister at that time. He considered that private and public were just as dignified as it and on the same level. So this was really a shift that we could be observing the privatization process in Senegal. The higher education undergone a major reform in terms of professionalization of territories and of quality. So there is a kind of balance between the supply and the demand that was a major stake. To move a bit faster regarding diversity and disparities in this process, the increase I mentioned earlier can be clearly seen from the 70s to the years 2000. The number of students really increased. Now, looking at this created a difficulty in the capacity to meet the demand. Basically, what could be observed is that the increase of the private supply contributed to widening the offer, because over 300 higher education institutes appeared. Progressively, they will become one of the potential alternatives by hosting the students. But what can also be noticed is that despite the major number, only 20% of students are hosted in these kind of institutions. So the absorption rate is quite low, although the number is very important. Basically, these institutions remain located around the capital city, Dakar, And in the rest of the country, there are very, very few higher education trainings or possibilities. Now, looking at the distribution of all these students, we notice that the majority of them, well, majority of students in the public sector are women, although men are in majority in private institutions. It's something that could also be explained by the studying conditions. This creates a kind of hierarchy in the private sector because you've got the prestigious colleges that are well known for being of high quality and absorbing many students. A majority of students today are very well positioned in the mapping, although there is relatively low quality for institutions in other regions or in the suburbs. And there, what we can see, one of the weaknesses, it's basically that private universities, most of them, if they want to offer a doctorate courses, doctorate curricula, they have to be covered by public teachers. Also, such training incur additional tuition fees and public teachers working in the private sector. So once again, this was an upheaval, and the difference between the public and the private sector is reinforced by this privatization process, because we can see that there are more and more private trainings within public universities. To conclude with this third point, how do we handle such inequalities? The system remains very unequal, especially close to the city centers. We can clearly see the influence of the private sector in the way the supply is structured. This refers to the tuition fees, to the training costs, namely, and there, basically what I'm showing is a major difference between 2012 and 2013. There is a difference in terms of the gender parity index in the various cities. In the capital city, you have a bigger rate of enrolled students, although in other regions, there are major territorial discrepancies, namely in terms of access and of performance and of retention of students in the system. We also looked at who is being enrolled and where, and by crossing data and looking at where the parents studied themselves, we noticed that there are major common points between the parents and the children. For parents who studied in the private sector, their children tend to enroll themselves in a private institution. And this is quite obvious here as for the private sector here. Another difference that can be noted here is that in terms of the various curricula selected by the students, we noticed that the private sector students are mostly interested in economics, sciences and management. And this matches the needs of companies in terms of employers and employments. So to conclude, there are 4 points that are important. When talking about privatization today in Senegal, one of the major points is to look at the right to access, the diversity, the plurality of the supply. It remains quite high here, according to, well, within some private institution. And as mentioned earlier, most of the selective trainings within public universities are not free of charge and therefore private. The second thing is taking social inequalities into account. We can see a trend of quantitative generalization because more and more students enroll at university, but there is a gender disparity that is quite important. And on top of that, there is also a territorial disparity. Another point is that regarding the territorial disparities that remain, we also notice a decrease in terms of inequality because we need to improve this territorial imbalance. And if we want to improve the right to education in terms of access, we need to integrate employability and the various disparities. So we need to have this specific approach that would be a holistic, systemic approach that includes both the privatization process, but also that integrates the development of higher education, taking into account the needs of societies, namely the Senegal society. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Jean-Alain, for raising this perspective of Senegal and for bringing the historical perspective as well. It's very interesting to look at the development over a certain number of years and to see how systems developed and how they basically, how the systems were built, historically speaking. This also raised an important issue regarding territorial inequalities. We could also observe this in the case of France, and it's another question that is raised in terms of access to higher education. We can see that the gender issue remains also in Africa, so thank you very much for raising this, Jean-Alain. Now I am going to give the floor to Thibaut Lauwerier. So Thibaut Lauwerier is a teacher researcher at the Geneva University. As I said, he worked together with us on the research project. He is a coordinator of the French-speaking network on the privatization of higher education. Maybe you can say a few words on this, Thibaut, before. He works on international cooperation on education, on the quality of education in Western Africa, and on the privatization and marketisation of education in French-speaking Africa and Europe. Thibaut, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Delphine. So given the time that I'm allowed, I have just added a link to the network that Delphine just mentioned. I've copied it on the chat. So you can have a look at our website and have a look at our activities, our objectives. So I'm going to start introducing the privatization of higher education in France and Switzerland and its trends and impacts. So I'm going to focus on the situation in Geneva, because you have to know that the Swiss educational system is very decentralized and managed at canton level. And even though there might be similarities between the different cantons, each system has its specificities. So I'm going to give you two parallel studies that that have been conducted during the past few months, one of which by the Initiative to the Right for Education that had the objective to focus on the situation in France, comparing the latest data, especially during the COVID-19 period, because we know that the pandemic has had impacts on the sector. And another study that has been conducted by one of my academics on higher education in Geneva. I would like to say that the two studies haven't focused on the same topic exactly. So I'm not going to be able to compare both of them, but I can show you trends that we can find in both contexts. Sorry. So I'm going to start with a few trends that have been highlighted in the studies I mentioned. And the main trend that we have noticed in the other presentation is a growing privatization of, given that the private sector is getting bigger. So especially during the last 2 decades, very concretely in France, and you can see the chart here on the right side, it means that the enrollment in France represents 20% of higher education students. And in some places, they can go up to 30%. So we can see the increase of student enrollment in the private sector. And during the past 20 years or 30 years, as you might have seen on the graph, the growth of enrollment in the private sector is higher than in the public sector. We can also see an increase of the number of private institutions, obviously. And this growth is mainly for for-profit institutions, international groups that are trying to value their capital. This is a trend that we have noticed during the past few years. Also, I can mention another trend that we have noticed. It's an increase of private funds for public higher education. If I take the example of Geneva, private funds represent 1/5 for research. So this is a significant share, and they come from foreign companies that are investing in higher education. We can also notice another trend, and we can notice it outside of France or Switzerland, and it's during the COVID-19 pandemic, the presence of EdTech, new technologies, whether it's for students or teachers. We've had to keep on teaching during COVID-19, the pandemics. And obviously, companies have deployed numerous digital tools with video conference, etc. And I think that this should be a warning sign for us. The growing size of those companies, especially for the products are accessible, but for a very high cost for public institutions. So they have to invest a lot. Those companies, EdTech companies, can contribute to jeopardizing the public sector in a way because they are investing in tax havens, which is a cause of the that can jeopardize the public sector. And their growing involvement we have to be very careful about this. And we can also notice that this growing involvement of the private sector, whether it's in France or in Switzerland, has been facilitated by public policies, as we've seen in other contexts. We've seen that with the Bologna reform that has enabled accreditation through private companies, that has given credit to private institutions because their diploma is considered equivalent to the ones from the public sector. And that has enabled them to grow in size and in number. This privatization, we can notice that the mechanisms from the private sector are penetrating the public sector. We have observed, and here again, I'm going to talk about a trend that's not non-exhaustive. Public universities in France, for example, have recently acquired the possibility to create branches, and those branches could become a source of funding on the long term, for example, fostering sponsorship or acquiring real estate. They're using public money, public funding, but in a private way. Another way of doing so, of becoming more private, is the internationalization of educational policies, which in a context of globalization has pushed higher educational institutes to place themselves in the global economy. I can give you the example of, for example, Shanghai, which is one of the most famous, that is becoming a merchandising sector. And that we can say through training that is mostly focused on business, economy. So in Geneva, we've been mentioned a lot this kind of classification to acquire more and more funding and more students. So they are placing themselves in this kind of competition. Also, you know that in the SDGs, we have extended the objectives of education so that we no longer have just the basic education, but education all throughout your life. And this is shown by a growing number of vocational training that are sponsored by the private sector, and they have much higher cost than initial or mainstream training, mainstream education. And the budget adapted to each of these trainings need to correspond to the reality of the job market. So public universities are developing this kind of vocational training that have higher costs. And in research, we have a trend that is also showing the penetration of the private into the public sector. In research, publishing your studies, your research is something that's compulsory to get a job, as long as you are published in the right magazines. And those magazines are owned by private owners. I can think about Elsevier, Springer Nature, who publish scientific articles which are funded by public funding or by public entities. In this, for example, Swiss Lauwerier have spent a fortune this year, and they're spending a very significant amount of their budget for creative learning, for exchange, for some kind of educational exchange. So there is a will to go towards open access of publications and knowledge, but the practice in place isn't going that way. And it's hard, it's still hard to have free open access to those articles, to those research. So what are the impacts in France and in Switzerland? I'd like to insist on the fact that on one impact, which is, I think, the worst, which is the increasing socioeconomic inequalities. And this is not the only effect of privatization, but to me, it is the worst. So we have noticed that the most privileged students have access to private institutions since the tuition fees are very high. For example, in France, it's about 10,000 euros a year, and they can be even higher for some institutions. And tuition fees in those institutions have been growing up since the 1980s. And in France, even if in France we have 20% of students who come from less privileged students in the private sector and 40% in the public sector, the scholarships are not covering all of their tuition fees. And we have seen that the fees have been growing up for the past decades. In addition to that, tuition fees that are very high, we can see that there are, in both contexts, additional fees or indirect costs that are linked to higher education, such as lodging or transportation fees that are as high for the public sector or the private sector. And students have to find alternative solutions, mobilizing their families, taking loans, or finding an employment during their studies, which is not the case for privileged students. So I recommend that you read the excellent report that was written by Initiative for Higher Education, which talks about the impact of indirect costs for students. So in the end, the idea is to insist on the fact that most higher education institutions are reserved to the most privileged. And given that the institutions are raising their tuition fees, the gap is just widening over the years. In this context, more support from the state would be a crucial help. But in the last decades, it hasn't been balanced according to the demand or according to the fact that students, especially the less privileged ones, are struggling. So I'd like to remind you that those 2 points, that there are more and more private higher education institutions, and this is widening the gap between privileged students and the ones who are less privileged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thibaut, for this very interesting presentation. I noted namely the issue of distance learning and of tech companies that you mentioned, especially as regard tax havens. I think it's a very important issue to mention because this might contribute, well, private actions that might contribute to develop education is good, but if it ends up with tax havens and not contributing to funding global education, then it becomes an issue. You also raised this issue of competition between universities and the issue of globalization of the higher education that involves both universities and higher education institutions that are all put under pressure. And I really appreciate your comment on the open access and how to make accessible, how to make knowledge accessible, including software, IT techniques, how to make it accessible to a wider audience. So this was very rich, very rich discussion, and I'm going to switch in English.
We have very limited time because the event was planned until now. But and I ask you if there are any question or comments to put it on the chat. But I don't see any now. So I don't know if anyone would like to comment or raise a question. Otherwise, I'd make some final comments based on what have been said. I really encourage you to type anything in the chat, or I don't know, the presenter, if you have any resources to share. I've seen Eleanor sharing our work in France, but feel free to share links to your own research so people can follow up after the events. I think there are more to say on this topic on higher education, and I think, and I do really hope, like UNESCO during the World Conference this week, we'll discuss this question on the financing of higher education, because for me this is the key. This is the only way we are going to address this question of inequality and stop this circle of reproducing inequality in society through the education system. Will be very interesting, and I hope we will have follow-up conversation to discuss the question of territorial inequality in comparison with other countries, the question of gender inequalities as well, like Jean-Alain have highlighted that in Senegal, but it will be interesting to see how this reproduce in other places, how the huge impact of distance learning is also transforming the education system, and how we ensure like this is not going to divert fund to continue to sustain a strong education, higher education system, public education system of good quality. This is also something I would like to maybe raise for all the researchers who are here, and maybe our partner from civil society organization and from UNESCO being with us today. Can we look as well at a good example of public education systems that at higher education levels that can be inclusive and sustain a better equality? And I think it was very interesting, this case of Brazil, like showing how public education is of good quality, but maybe not inclusive enough. And my understanding is we see this increase of privatization in higher education because they are need to absorb the number of students that access higher education, but where we don't budget for that. So will be interesting to go a bit deeper on this question. And maybe my last comments will be as well to this question of merit and capacity and the selection to access higher education system. I know UNESCO is reflecting on this topic at the moment. And the presentation you shared today about the dynamic in the different continents, we see how this have an impact. Either it's a selection through the results and the selectivity based on what they said, capacity or merit, but also about the repartition of where as a institution. So it was very interesting to look at this different perspective in different continents, and for sure to see like in all places there are really an increase of the private institution linked with issue around inequality and segregation, and question around the financing and how the public funding is also diverted to private actors, including for-profit actors. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for sharing your contact and your paper. You can, I said that for all the people being with us today, you may find the link here, some contacts and link in the chat. I'm very glad we've been able to have these events in different languages, and I really wish we can do that more. Of course, there are always a cost and some technicality to address, but I think, and I said that to everyone, including to UNESCO being with us with today, but I know they are the first one to facilitate this type of discussion, but it's really important. We can have a different perspective and different angle from people, not maybe having English as an easy language to discuss. So really glad we have this discussion, diversity of background and culture and languages today. This is part of higher education as well. I've been raised in a recent discussion about how we can have our own language and mother tongue language in higher education as well, when we see a lot of uniformization with the English language as well in higher education. So thank you very much to all of you. Huge thanks for the translators that have allowed us to have this discussion in different languages. Thank you for all of you who have joined this discussion, and for sure we will have follow-up conversation on this topic, and looking forward to meet the one who will be in Barcelona this week for discussing more on higher education. Thank you very much, and see you soon for further discussion. Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias. Muito obrigada.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.